Hello, my friends. It's me, Klaire, and I'm excited to share with you Feral Housewife, my Thunderdomesticity costume workshop. I originally created this workshop in anticipation for a Thunderdomesticity party, and the creations everyone made were so much fun. I wanted to make sure that you also had access to the same information. This video is part of the curriculum at the Unaccredited College of Klaire, an absurd school with comprehensive art lessons. To learn more, please visit patreon.com/Klaire Lockheart or search for Unaccredited College of Klaire. You can sign up today or share the link with your artsy friends. But before I dive in on how to create your own post-apocalyptic feminine costume, I want to give you a little background about Thunderdomesticity. Thunderdomesticity is, of course, a combination of Thunderdome and domesticity. This is a collaborative art series with photographer Aaron C. Packard. Now, I create these mid-century archetypical women's costuming, and I also put together the accessories, do the hair and makeup, and then Aaron will photograph these warrior women in wasteland settings. And the purpose of this series is to be able to create some women protagonists. In post-apocalyptic media, especially in movies, women tend not to exist, and if they do, they're mistreated. Also, their costuming typically is, well, it often looks like it's just made out of the scraps of what the men's costuming is like. So instead of wasting time waiting for someone else to create media that creates a protagonist, a hero for women or people of other marginalized genders to look up to, we've developed this Thunderdomesticity series. And as I said, I create the costuming, and some of these costumes I create all the way from scratch. Like this green dress is a pattern I drafted based off of a vintage dress I had that I didn't want to distress for the series, but I'll also modify existing clothing. Now today, I'm going to show you how to do some modifications in order to create your own post-apocalyptic feminine archetype type costuming. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think it would be fun to have more people involved in this art series and to have more feminist, feminine heroes. Before I show you any construction techniques, allow me to share all the materials you'll need for this project. To start off with, you'll need a 1950s style housewife dress or apron. So think of what a sitcom mom would wear on an old black and white TV show. We're aiming for mid-century American women's clothing. So the dress you select shouldn't be too tight. A puffier skirt is pretty good because it does have that 1950s silhouette, and also it would allow you to romp around in the post-apocalyptic landscape. You want to make sure that it's not low cut, and then also the hemline should be at knee length or lower. If distressing a dress is a little too intimidating right now, I do recommend starting off with an apron. I'm going to use an apron for my example, and it's actually an apron that I made for one of my feminine attempts paintings, but I already finished that painting, I don't need the apron anymore, and now it's going to become a Thunderdomesticity accessory. You'll also need thread, a needle, fabric scraps, sewing scissors, seam ripper, and cheap acrylic paint. I do recommend having red, brown, and black for your paint, and the cheaper the better. Now, I want to emphasize you don't need to buy a lot of materials for this costuming project. Look around and see what you already have available. Ask your friends if they have any of these supplies. Even better yet, invite them over and then all of you can make Thunderdomesticity style costumes together. But really, go through and purge your sewing, your art supply, your craft room, and see what you have already. Now I'm going to show you these steps as though you are an absolute beginner. So whether you have never sewn before or it's been a while, I am going to show you a lot of hand sewing techniques. So I have sewing machine as a suggested material. You don't need to have one, but I am going to show you some steps you can take with it. I also recommend having a thimble, pliers, and go through your old broken jewelry, your Halloween stuff. Check out your local thrift store and see if you can pick up some rivets, chains, patches, anything else that you think would look good as a post-apocalyptic accessory. I'm going to walk you through the steps to distress your dress or your apron. Now, a key point with your Thunderdomesticity costume is that it should be practical and functional. And one of the first things we need to do is make sure that you have big pockets. So whether your dress or your apron doesn't have any pockets at all, or they're too small, I'm going to show you how to add pockets to your outfit. Now, first of all, you're going to use one of those scraps of fabric and cut out a large rectangle. For me, I typically will set my phone down on the fabric and cut around it so it's big enough to fit inside. I know you probably won't have cell service after doomsday, but this is just pretend, and I do like having my phone and my keys and my wallet on me, so I make nice big pockets. You could also just set your hand down and make sure that the fabric you're cutting is big enough to allow you to actually put your hand inside the pocket. So I have a rectangle that's big enough to be practical, and you'll notice through my example I am not pressing my fabric. I don't mind that it is wrinkly for this particular project. And if your fabric is a little too wrinkly to manage, you are more than welcome to iron it. But I just wanted to share that caveat with you. So I'm going to create the top edge of my pocket, and what I'm going to do is fold over that top edge of fabric by about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to fold it down again. I'm basically rolling that raw edge of the fabric inside. I don't want it to come unraveled, and I have that double overlap pinned in place. Now, if your fabric is misbehaving, you could iron it at this point. Now, I'm going to show you these steps as though you have no sewing experience or it's been a while since you've done any hand sewing. So I'm going to try and take it nice and slow and show you these very broken down steps because I don't want you to get frustrated while you're working. And if this is one of your first sewing projects, this is fantastic because I want to share with you when I create my costumes, I do almost all of it hand sewn. And then I also do a lot of the sewing when I am the passenger in long car trips. And I do that on purpose because the bumping and jostling in the vehicle makes my stitching uneven and a little messier. And I feel that that adds to this post-apocalyptic aesthetic. So don't worry about having messy stitches, or if you're out of practice, it's going to be perfect. So anyway, I need to thread my needle, and you can see that I have selected using needles with a pretty big eye because it makes putting the thread in a lot easier. If you're having a hard time seeing my needle, I do apologize because I am holding it with my thumb. It's between the thumb and the spool of thread, and it is parallel to my cutting board. But you can see I've already put the thread through the eye of the needle. And when I sew, I like to have my thread doubled up. It just gives it more strength, and then it also makes the thread more noticeable. I am purposefully going to use contrasting fabric and thread as I sew. Now, you can have everything match if you prefer that aesthetic. That is completely fine. I am using a lot of different colors because I am purging some old sewing supplies. I also wanted to make it visible to you in my demonstration, but it also shows up in the photos, and that is part of the fun, is this hand done element. Anyway, so in my right hand I'm holding my needle, and you can see my left hand the edge of the thread. So I have a double thickness of thread. Now when you're doing hand sewing, you want to make sure that you're not cutting really long pieces of thread because it gets tangled up way too easily. After I have cut it off the spool, I'm going to tie a knot at the end. I'm holding both of the pieces together as though it is only one piece of thread. It's kind of like you have those pull and peel Twizzlers and you have two of them still stuck together. So it technically only counts as one, right? So you're going to imagine it's just one piece of thread, and what I'm going to have you do is tie a knot at the end. And the way that I do it is I will loop that thread around and I'll poke the end through that loop. It's going to look like a little tiny pretzel, and when I have the edge of that thread looped through that loop, I'm going to pull it and create a knot. Now often I'll have a little too much hanging off the edge of my knot, and I'll snip that off. Usually about 1/4 of an inch is okay. Don't cut too close to the knot because then it might come undone later. To start off on the top edge of my pocket, I'm actually going to sew from the back side. That way I can make sure that I'm going to hit all of the layers of fabric. But I need to start with a knot, and what I'm going to do is shove the needle through all 3 layers to the front and then back all 3 layers to the back. I'll pull the thread almost all the way through, and you can see my knot is very, very close to my fabric. There's just enough to create a teeny tiny little loop. And what I did was I pushed my needle through that loop, and then I pulled on that thread, and it catches on the knot. That way my stitching will be secure and it will not come undone later. From there, I'm just going to push my needle in and out of the fabric, making sure I go through all 3 layers to the front and to the back. I want to make sure I don't pull too tight that it puckers the fabric, but I'm just going to go all the way until I reach the end. When I get to the end, I need to tie another knot. And if you have a different technique to use, that is completely okay. I just want to show you what I do. And on the back, I'm going to create my knot by hooking it to an adjacent stitch. You can see that I've pushed the needle from the bottom through the top of that nearby stitch. And I'm going to push the needle through that loop and pull it so it creates a knot. The reason I am tying my knot to that nearby stitch is so it won't wiggle its way out through the fabric later on. And I tend to do double knots just to make sure everything is secure. And when it's ready, I'm going to snip off that excess thread. Remember, leave about 1/4 of an inch so that way the knot doesn't come undone later on accident. After I have that top edge, I can decide where I want my pocket to go. After I've decided placement, I am going to prepare it to sew it down. So that finished edge on the top is the top edge of the pocket, and I will be folding in the sides and the bottom. And I'm just snipping off little tiny triangles of the corners because it removes some excess fabric and it reduces bulk. You can kind of see through the fabric of this pocket, and I folded the sides and the bottom underneath the pocket itself. It's about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch, and then I pinned it in place so that way it doesn't wiggle around while I am trying to sew. The first thing that I did is at the top corner is I tied a knot, and I wanted to make sure this is really secure because a lot of pressure happens at corners of pockets and you want to make sure it's strong. I use that same sewing technique I did on that top edge of the pocket to attach the pocket itself to my fabric, to my apron. So I just pushed my needle in and out, going back and forth with a running stitch. At the corner, I wanted to make sure that my sewing was secure. This is a big loose stitch, and I didn't want the fabric to pucker or pull, especially when I am using these pockets. So I make sure to tie knots at the corners. I continued sewing around this pocket until I almost ran out of thread. You'll know when you're ready to tie a knot when you have a little bit of thread beyond the length of the needle. I knew I was getting close, so what I did was I pushed my needle through to the back side and I tied my knot on the back. What I did was that very similar stitch that I did when I finished the top edge of the pocket previously. So I put my needle through the adjacent stitch, created a loop, and then pushed it through. So you can see that it's kind of like a tilted pretzel. I'm tying my knot on the back just because I don't want that little floppy bit of thread on the front. You can tie it there, that's completely okay. It's the post-apocalypse, not all the rules matter. Anyway, so I tied the knot, and when I finished that, I resumed sewing the pocket in place. I also want to note that I used a double knot when I finished sewing my pocket to make sure that it is sturdy and it can stand the stress of me actually putting items in the pocket. Once you get that first pocket done, that is a pretty big accomplishment. So that's really good. I am going to show you how to create another pocket using a slightly different technique. I'll begin by making sure that I have a big rectangle that's large enough to be practical. And then I'm going to fold over that top edge 2 times. That way I am encapsulating that cut edge of the fabric because I won't want it to unravel later on, and I'll pin it in place. Once again, I am embracing the wrinkly quality of my fabric so that way it does look more post-apocalyptic. I am using a machine this time. If you prefer to hand stitch or you don't have access to a sewing machine, you can still do these same steps by hand like I showed you with the first pocket. But if you are ready to try using a sewing machine, I have my machine set to a straight stitch. If you are more experienced with costuming and sewing and you have access to a machine that has fancier and decorative stitching, please feel free to experiment with that. But for right now, I'm just using the straight stitch. And when I start off, I'll sew just a teeny tiny bit, and then I will use the reverse button so the machine will sew backwards, and then I come forward again because that is securing the thread. It's essentially creating a knot. I will straight stitch all the way across the top edge of my pocket, and then I will do that back and forth sewing again to make sure that that thread will stay in place and won't come undone later on. You can see in my picture on the left and on the right, the thread is thicker because I went back and forth. After I am done sewing the top edge of the pocket, I'm going to decide where to place it. And I'm also going to snip off those little corners on the bottom edges to reduce the bulk of the fabric. Once again, I am going to fold the sides and the bottom of the pocket over about 1/2 inch and pin the pocket in place. I'm using the machine for this, but it is going to repeat the same steps that I did when I was hand sewing. The difference is instead of tying knots and double knots, I am going to use that back stitching. So I'll start off in the corner and I'll sew forwards and backwards a few times just to make sure the top edge of my pocket is really strong. When I get to the corners on the bottom edges of the pocket, I also do that forwards and back motion with the sewing machine, and it also helps me to go slower so that way I could do that 90-degree turn a little easier. After I have it sewn all the way around the edges, I'll snip off the thread and double check and make sure that the folded edges are covered, they're included with the stitching, so my fabric, my pocket is strong and sturdy. And once you have 2 pockets in place, you are on a roll. The next step is to add patches. This can be a little intimidating, but it's a lot of fun. For this step, you'll need scissors, scraps of fabric, thread, needle, and your seam ripper. So I have been patching fabric for as long as I could remember in a practical way. And I'm going to use some of those same techniques for the costume patches. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I have found out with this project, it is so much easier to sew the patch on, then cut the hole, and then finish patching up and mending the fabric. Now, if the garment you're using already has holes in it, you'll use the traditional technique of adding the patch to the hole. But if you're starting from scratch and you're creating these holes yourself, try it this way. It's a lot easier and it'll save you a ton of time. So when I mend fabric, I typically will try to have my patch and my thread match the original fabric, and I'm not doing that today because I want the patches and the repair work to be noticeable, especially because I imagine in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, resources will be scarce and you'll just use what you have on hand. It also makes my demonstration a little easier. So when I am repairing fabric, I will usually put the patch on the underside in order to camouflage it a little better. And even though I'm using very bright colors, I'm still going to use those same techniques. You can do the patches on the front of the fabric if you want, but I'm showing you from the back side. Now that I'm ready to begin sewing, I'm going to push my needle through the patch and the fabric, and I'm going to keep that little tiny opening right before the knot. I'll push the needle through and have the thread catch on itself so I have a sturdy knot that won't come undone later. I'm just going to do that basic in and out, forward and back stitch around the perimeter of my fabric. If you know how to do fancier sewing or embroidery, by all means use them on your costume, but I am just doing a simple running stitch in order to show the hasty nature of repairing this costume in the post-apocalyptic landscape. After I have sewn all the way around the edges, I'll tie a knot and then cut the excess thread off. When you're done sewing your patch, flip it over to the outside of the garment and you'll have a nice little border that will show you how big you can make your hole. Now I have found I really enjoy using a seam ripper to distress the fabric. Some people can use scissors, but if you choose to do that, be very careful that you don't cut through the new piece of fabric you just sewed to your costume. I like to use the seam ripper and I'll poke the little sword edge in through and carefully rip a tiny hole. Once I have a hole in place, I can continue to rip and tear the fabric using my seam ripper. I enjoy using it because it frays the edges of the fabric, and I will keep many of those loose threads on the hole to make it look more natural. I'm going to repair this hole using a very similar technique that I've been using all along. I'll start off by having my thread doubled up with a knot at the end, and I will hook the thread in on itself. The difference is when I am sewing, I'm going to use a horizontal or a diagonal pattern. That's because I want the thread to be half on the original fabric and half on the patch fabric. This will make it sturdier and help it withstand washing and wear. After I go all the way around the edge of the hole or holes, I'll tie another knot. If you look closely, you'll notice that I am not bothering to put the knots on the back side of the fabric. I'm okay with leaving that little bit of thread to add some texture for the roughness of my costume. I also want to demonstrate how to sew a patch with your machine. I'm going to pin my repair fabric to the back side of my clothing. And instead of using a straight stitch, I switched my machine to a zigzag. And a zigzag is really good for patching because it can go over the edges of the fabric, and that will prevent it from fraying or coming apart in the future. After I sewed the patch on the fabric, then I tore the holes into my apron, and I continued to use the zigzag stitch around the edges of the holes and the tears. I am not sewing very nicely on purpose. I do want that rough texture to show up, and I am purposefully leaving some of these loose threads on there. Like I said, the texture really shows up, and I enjoy having that in this costume. Once I get all of the edges done, I will use that technique of sewing backwards and forwards with the machine to overlap the thread. That will prevent it from unraveling later on. I would also like to show you how to add a decorative patch or a patch on the outside of the fabric, one that does draw attention to itself on purpose. So this time I cut a hole with the scissors because I wanted to show you what that looks like by comparison. And then I cut out a little heart out of a scrap of red fabric. I pinned it in place on the outside this time because I want to draw attention to the patch. I used that zigzag stitch again, overlapping the edge of the fabric. This will prevent it from fraying too much because I want that shape to be recognizable. And once again, to finish that, I sewed back and forth to conceal the edges of the thread to keep it from unraveling at a future time. And I just keep on adding patches and tearing up the costume. I want it to look like the character has been surviving and thriving for a long time in this post-apocalyptic landscape. And so that's why I have a lot of damage and repair work to the costumes that I create. I want to show you a few additional distressing and decoration techniques you can incorporate into your own Thunderdomesticity style costume. It's fun to add some non-functional patches. I tend to use canvas because I paint a lot and I have a lot of canvas scraps around. You'll notice on this one I crossed my stitches so they created little X's on the edge. It is a little more decorative and it also helps me overlap the edge of the canvas so it won't fray too much in the future. I also recommend tearing up the bottom hem of your skirt, your dress, or your apron. It makes it a lot of fun. It's also a really great technique if your dress is a little too short for the time period. What I recommend doing is taking the seam ripper and undoing the hem all along the bottom edge. That will help add some length to the skirt, and then it'll have a rough and tattered edge. And I do recommend using your seam ripper to create some little holes near the bottom edge as well. If you're feeling brave, you can even cut off small segments of the hem. If you have rivets or other doodads, add them to your costume as well. I do recommend holding off on anything that would not survive the washing machine just yet, but things that are designed for clothing like rivets, such as these little stars, would be okay to add. And to install these, they have prongs on them, and I just shoved them through the fabric, and then I used my thimble to press down inwards on itself so the metal would clasp onto the fabric through all the layers. And you are welcome to add as many patches and damages and decorations to your apron or your dress as you want to. Once you're done with the modifications, you'll be ready to stain with acrylic paint. Now, I highly recommend wearing old clothes you don't mind getting dirty and doing this step outdoors. It does get pretty messy. And for this step, you're going to add paint splatters. Earlier, I said you want to use cheap acrylic paint, and that's because it tends to be more watery. If you're using up old paint that's a little dried out or chunky, that's perfectly fine. Just put some water in the bottle and shake it up, but remember to do that step outside. I like to use reds, browns, and blacks for this step. I typically start off with the red because it's a little too bright and I can dull it down in the subsequent steps. You're just going to take your dress or your apron outside and do your best 1960s abstract expressionist action painter and flick paint all over your costume. And it's okay if it looks a little too neat and planned at first, because I'm going to encourage you to work quickly and that will help smear the paint. Now, you could use other techniques to dye and stain your project, but I recommend using acrylic paint because it's affordable, it gives some texture onto the fabric, especially for this next step. I will use some paint with a fair amount of water in an old bucket and create a dye out of it. I prefer to use this to traditional dye because the paint bonds with the fibers and it makes the fabric stiff and it looks cruddy and gross, but it doesn't actually smell or have actual dirty stuff on it. So your costume is still fairly clean even though it looks very distressed and worn. So I use a bucket that I don't need anymore. I squirt in a little bit of paint and I mix it up with a lot of water. Ice cream buckets would probably work better for full dresses, so this is an excuse to go get some dessert. Otherwise, whatever container you have on hand should work just fine. I like having the bottom edge look darker and be more distressed, and so I typically will roll up my dress or my apron and dip the hem in first and let it soak for a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to be working quickly. When I wad up my clothing, it helps smear that paint to make it bond to the fabric a little more and look a little bit more natural instead of purposefully painted or placed on. After I've let the bottom edge soak in that dye bath, I will wad up the rest of the fabric and shove it in that bucket and let it sit for just a little bit. It doesn't take too long with paint. After a few minutes, I will pull out my apron or my dress and let it dry outdoors. You can let it dry on the ground if you don't mind leaves and so forth sticking to it. Otherwise, a clothing line or a clothes drying rack is perfect for this. But let it dry before you bring it inside. And I do recommend running it through the washer and dryer if you're feeling brave and you think it'll hold up. I like to do this because it helps fray some of those cut edges a little bit more and it takes out some of those really obnoxious parts of the paint that I don't want that looked a little too purposeful. This is why I recommend waiting to add fur and leather and a lot of these other metal doodads and accessories until the very end, so after you've run it through the washer and dryer. Creating your post-apocalyptic costume is quite a feat. So after you've spent all this time, effort, and money, I want you to take this very important step to go forth and kick ass. You should wear your awesome Thunderdomesticity costume. And to help complete the look, you want to bring in various accessories. For some reason, belts are very important in the post-apocalypse, so grab all your belts and put them on, get any funky jewelry, raid your steampunk costumes and accessories, do up your hair in a punk rock or pin-up style, put on a bunch of makeup, and I want to make sure that you have some very comfortable and practical footwear. A lot of times in movies, women are often wearing high heels that do not look practical for a post-apocalyptic environment. And so I really want to stress that the footwear, the boots, the shoes you wear should be flat and they should look very comfortable. They should be comfortable and they should be functional. So make sure that your footwear is very practical. In this costume that I'm wearing, I also distressed a pair of leggings to go with my dress. After you put all that effort together, you should document it. Take a lot of photos in your awesome costume. Do some selfies, have a friend come out, collaborate with a professional photographer like I do. It's a lot of fun. And I would love to see your creation. This is a fun project and I enjoy incorporating other people and their interpretation. So please post your pictures on social media, but use the Thunderdomesticity hashtag so that way I have a chance of seeing it. Here is a group photo of several people who made their own costumes based on the workshop that I'm teaching you today. And I wanted to share that with you so you could get some inspiration for your costume. Your costume can be as elaborate or as simple as you want it to be, but it's just a lot of fun. And I really appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about the Thunderdomesticity series. And I am elated that you are going to make an awesome Thunderdomesticity costume. I can't wait to see your photos. If this workshop was helpful or inspiring to you, please make sure to follow me at patreon.com/Klaire Lockheart.